So, we were talking about the social contract and how this implicit agreement between people, all giving up their rights to a king, creates civil society. And once the king had been installed, all the different wills of the different individuals in the state are united into one single person. This is what the word person can sometimes mean. It doesn't necessarily mean an individual physical person. In the law, we can talk about a collective of different individuals as a single person when they're united by a common interest, a common goal, a set of rules and regulations. A corporation is viewed under the law as a single person. That's what a corporation means. It's a single legal person, and you can take it to court, etc., etc. And that's how Hobbes saw the state. Once the king had been recognized and set in power, everyone became one single person. That's what you find on certain coins in the United States. It says e pluribus unum, which is Latin for from the many, one. And Hobbes states, a multitude of men are made one person when they are by one man or one person represented, so that it be done with the consent of every one of that multitude in particular. For it is the unity of the representer, not the unity of the represented, that maketh the person one. And it is the representer that beareth the person, but one person, and unity cannot otherwise be understood in multitude. Don't know how well you can see this, but this is the frontispiece that was put on the original edition in the 1740s or 50s of Hobbes's Leviathan. And if you can somehow zoom in to see the figure depicted close up, you can see that the figure's torso is made up of lots of different people. It's a single body made up of lots of other bodies. And this single entity is what the Leviathan of the book's title refers to. The Leviathan was a biblical monster and a symbol of strength and power, and Hobbes chose it to symbolize the power of the state. It's what he meant in the quote we saw before when he said, the great Leviathan, or rather that mortal god to which we, under the immortal God, owe our peace and defense. The Leviathan, the mortal god that we must obey, is not the king alone, but the whole population gathered and unified and represented by the will of the king. But in order to ensure this unity of will, the king needs absolute control. Social contract grants the king absolute ultimate power. The law is what he says it is. There's no law beyond and above the law of the king. Subjects can't change the government in any way. Once men have created the king, they can't uncreate him. Once they've given up their natural rights to him, they can't get them back. They're given, not loaned. The sovereign can use all means to secure his own power, including the right of censorship, corporal or capital punishment, etc., etc. If the sovereign gives in any way and allows his authority to be challenged, the state begins to slide a little bit further back into that chaotic state of nature that the state was erected to prevent against. I've said the sovereign is a creation of the social contract, but he isn't himself party to that contract. The king hasn't signed it, explicitly or implicitly. He isn't bound by the law that he creates. Hobbes thought that he couldn't be. He had to stand outside the law in order to enforce the law. He had to do what others weren't allowed to do in order to maintain his power over them, and thus the law itself. The law could be interpreted and applied by lawyers and magistrates, and enforced by the police, but who kept them in line? Well, the chief of police could keep the police in line, but who kept him in line? Parliament Well, who kept them in line? The hierarchical control that maintained law and order had to stop somewhere. There had to be a fixed point outside the system. And that's what sovereignty meant for Hobbes. Richard Nixon was President of the United States from 1968 until 1973, and he eventually resigned, facing impeachment for a huge array of criminal activities. And in the famous Frost Nixon interview that he gave afterwards, that they made a movie about, David Frost confronted him with these crimes, and his response is now famous. And it has a very Hobbesian sound to it. He says this.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
By definition.
Exactly.
This is effectively what Hobbes is saying. He, like Nixon, believes that the law is the will of the king, or the will of the president, the will of the sovereign. That's what the law meant. Hobbes wasn't in any way naive about the abuses of people like Nixon, or the Nixons of his day. He wasn't naive about people like King Charles. He wasn't in any way sentimental about royalty. As I say, there wasn't anything particularly flattering about his view of the holders of sovereignty. But he would always simply ask. He would ask you, if you didn't like it, to compare the abuses of a king to the abuses that exist in a life without kings, life before kings came along, or life when the authority of the king had broken down. Hobbes says, but a man may here object that the condition of subjects is very miserable, as being vulnerable to the lusts and other irregular passions of him or them that have so unlimited a power in their hands. That the estate of man can never be without some incommodity or other, and that the greatest that in any form of government can possibly happen to the people in general is scarce sensible in respect to the miseries and horrible calamities that accompany a civil war, or that dissolute condition of masterless men without subjection to laws and a coercive power to tie their hands. If you don't like government, think about a world without government. That was what Hobbes is essentially saying. And that's how he justifies absolute royal sovereign power.